something just happened to Nvidia, and it was barely explained to the public. One of the most powerful tech companies on Earth is now dealing with consequences it didn't plan for. While everyone was distracted by AI hype, a political move in the US quietly forced Nvidia to reshuffle where its most powerful GPUs go, away from everyday buyers and straight into data centers, government deals, and geopolitical crossfire. That single shift changed everything. Prices started acting strange, supply tightened, backlash began spreading. At the center of it all is Jensen Huang, caught between governments, AI giants, and millions of regular buyers suddenly pushed to the back of the line. Because this isn't just about gaming GPUs anymore, it's about who gets access to power and who pays more when they don't. And once you see how subscription pushes and US-China restrictions collided, you'll understand why this backlash exploded and why it's only getting worse. What actually triggered the backlash? Here's the part most people never saw coming. The backlash didn't start because Nvidia made a bad GPU. It didn't start because performance dropped or innovation slowed. It started because Nvidia quietly changed who its GPUs were really for. Behind the scenes, Nvidia began redirecting massive amounts of chip supply away from everyday consumer markets and toward AI data centers. This wasn't a gradual transition. It happened quickly and deliberately. AI customers don't behave like normal buyers. They don't wait for discounts or argue over pricing. They sign billion-dollar contracts and lock in supply for years. From Nvidia's perspective, that kind of demand is impossible to ignore. At the same time, a political decision in the United States tightened export controls on advanced chips. Overnight, Nvidia could no longer sell its most powerful hardware freely across global markets. Entire regions became restricted, uncertain, or politically risky. So Nvidia made a choice. It rerouted supply toward the safest and most profitable destinations: large AI companies, data centers, and government-approved deals. Enterprise buyers moved to the front of the line. Regular consumers were pushed back. That's when the effects became impossible to ignore. GPUs that should have been widely available suddenly weren't. Prices stayed high even when demand cooled. New gaming cards launched that felt like poor value compared to what came before. At first, people blamed temporary issues, supply chains, inflation, bad timing. But the pattern didn't stop, and frustration slowly turned into backlash. From Nvidia's point of view, the logic was clear. Data centers bring higher margins, predictable demand, and political protection. Consumer GPUs bring price sensitivity, complaints, and thin profit margins. So Nvidia chose stability over loyalty. At the center of that decision is Jensen Huang, now caught between governments setting the rules, AI giants demanding priority, access, and millions of everyday buyers realizing they are no longer the priority. That realization is what actually triggered the backlash, because once supply shifts upstream, the pressure always rolls downhill. The price shock that's about to hit everyone. When consumers lose access to something powerful, the damage doesn't stay isolated. It spreads outward, quietly at first, and then all at once. Nvidia's shift away from consumer supply isn't just making GPUs harder to buy. It's setting off a chain reaction that threatens to push prices higher across entire categories of technology people rely on every day. Here's how that happens. When a massive share of Nvidia's chip output gets locked into AI data centers and long-term enterprise contracts, the consumer market doesn't simply get fewer products. It loses bargaining power. Retail supply tightens, competition weakens, and prices stop responding to normal signals like falling demand or older hardware aging out. That's how inflation begins in tech markets. Not through panic, but through priority. GPU prices staying high isn't a mystery. It's the result of supply being redirected toward buyers who don't care about cost. AI companies aren't waiting for discounts. Governments aren't comparing price to performance. They're securing access, whatever it takes. And once those buyers dominate the front of the line, there's no pressure left to bring prices down for everyone else. But GPUs are only the first domino. AI hardware consumes enormous amounts of VRAM and high-end memory. When enterprise buyers lock up that supply, memory pricing across the entire market starts to creep upward. Graphics cards get more expensive. System RAM follows. Suddenly, even mid-range PCs, laptops, and workstations cost noticeably more than they did a year ago. This is where the squeeze becomes visible. A reasonable upgrade now costs hundreds more. Entry-level builds drift into mid-range pricing. Laptops with decent specs jump in price. Even refurbished or last-generation hardware starts selling at a premium because new alternatives are scarce, and it doesn't stop at computers. Higher GPU and memory costs ripple into game consoles, professional workstations, creative tools, and even cloud services that quietly raise subscription prices to cover their own rising hardware costs. What looks like a GPU problem slowly turns into a tech-wide price problem. Scarcity also attracts opportunists. Scalpers step in. Overpriced partner cards become the default. MSRP turns into a theoretical number instead of something you actually pay. Buyers feel pressured to grab whatever is available, afraid that waiting will only make things worse. That pressure changes behavior. People overpay to avoid missing out. They settle for worse value. They convince themselves the situation is temporary, but it isn't, because this market isn't broken. It's being redirected. And once consumers realize they're no longer just competing with each other, but with governments, defense contracts, and trillion-dollar AI projects, the fear sets in. Fear that prices will spike again. Fear that access will keep shrinking. Fear that the cost of waiting will be higher than the cost of buying now. That's when frustration turns into backlash. Not because people hate success, but because they can feel an inflationary wave building before it fully hits. The subscription future, hiding in plain sight. When owning something becomes expensive, uncertain, and frustrating, renting starts to feel less like a choice and more like a nudge. That's the quiet shift happening right now. As GPUs get harder to access and prices stay stubbornly high, Nvidia's long-term direction becomes clearer. Instead of fighting to keep consumer ownership affordable, the company is increasingly normalizing a different idea. You don't need to own power, you just need access to it. This is where subscriptions and cloud services come in. On paper, tools like GeForce Now are sold as convenience. No expensive hardware, no upgrades, no waiting for stock to come back. Just log in and play. But look at the timing. These services didn't rise because consumers suddenly hated owning hardware. They rose as hardware became more expensive, scarcer, and harder to justify. When buying feels risky, renting feels safe. That's not an accident. From Nvidia's perspective, subscriptions solve multiple problems at once. They bypass supply constraints, they smooth out revenue, and most importantly, they turn one-time buyers into recurring payers. Instead of selling you a GPU every few years, Nvidia can monetize access every single month. And once that model takes hold, control quietly shifts. When you own hardware, you decide how long it lasts. You decide when to upgrade. You decide what you run and how you use it. When you rent performance, those decisions disappear. Access can be limited. Features can be locked behind higher tiers. Prices can rise overnight. You never finish paying, and you never fully own. This isn't just about gaming either. The same logic is spreading across creative work, AI tools, and professional software. Performance itself is becoming a service. Power is no longer something you buy, it's something you're granted. Scarcity accelerates that shift. When GPUs stay expensive and availability feels uncertain, subscriptions stop feeling optional. They start to feel like the only reliable door left open. People don't choose to rent because they prefer it. They adapt because ownership keeps slipping out of reach. That's what makes this moment important. Because once a market normalizes renting instead of owning, it rarely goes back. Companies gain leverage, consumers lose flexibility. And the idea of buying hardware outright starts to feel outdated, even if it costs more in the long run. And if you're still following this, this is the point where it's worth pausing for a second. If this breakdown is helping you see what's really happening behind the headlines, hit like so more people see it. And subscribe if you want deeper, no-fluff explanations of where tech, power, and money are actually moving. Because the force pushing this subscription future isn't just Nvidia's strategy. It's being accelerated by something much bigger and far more unstable. The US-China time bomb under Nvidia. This is where the story stops being just about business and starts looking like a slow-moving geopolitical crisis. The United States and China don't just compete economically, they distrust each other at a structural level. Technology, especially advanced computing power, sits right at the center of that tension, and Nvidia happens to control some of the most valuable pieces on the board. For years, US officials have warned that advanced GPUs aren't just graphics cards. They're dual-use technology, meaning the same chips that train AI models can also be used for surveillance systems, cyber warfare, weapons simulation, and military research. That concern didn't come out of nowhere. It's been building quietly across multiple administrations. Even before the current wave of AI hype, US policymakers were already tightening their grip on sensitive technology. Under the Trump administration, the first major cracks appeared. Trade wars, tariffs, blacklists. Huawei became the symbol of a new era where tech and national security were no longer separate conversations. That mindset never went away. Under later administrations, the strategy shifted from blunt pressure to targeted control. Instead of banning everything, the US focused on bottlenecks, semiconductors, manufacturing tools, and high-end chips. The goal was simple: slow China's access to the computing power needed to compete at the highest level. That's when Nvidia got pulled directly into the line of fire. Export controls were introduced and then tightened, restricting which GPUs could be sold to China and how powerful those chips were allowed to be. Nvidia tried to adapt by creating modified versions of its hardware, chips technically compliant on paper, but still useful enough to sell. For a while that worked. Then the rules changed again. Each new restriction forced Nvidia to redesign products, pause shipments, renegotiate contracts, and rethink entire supply plans. And every time that happened, uncertainty rippled through the global market. Here's the key point most people miss. When demand from China gets blocked, it doesn't disappear. It slams into other markets. Chips that were meant for one region suddenly get redirected. AI giants rush to lock in supply before the next rule change. Governments push for priority access under the banner of national security. Long-term contracts become more attractive than open consumer markets. That creates volatility, the kind markets hate. One month, supply loosens. The next, it tightens. Prices spike without warning. Launch plans shift. Availability becomes unpredictable. And because Nvidia sits at the center of so many industries, those shocks travel fast. There hasn't been a single dramatic security breach announcement tied to Nvidia specifically. And that's almost the point. This isn't about one incident. It's about fear of what could happen if advanced AI hardware flows freely into a rival superpower's hands. Fear drives policy. Policy drives restrictions. Restrictions drive market chaos. For Nvidia, this means constant pressure from both sides. US regulators demanding compliance and restraint. Chinese buyers searching for workarounds. AI companies racing to secure supply before politics shifts again. And in that environment, Nvidia does what any rational company would do. It prioritizes certainty, stable buyers, approved deals, long-term contracts, customers that won't be cut off by the next executive order or policy update. Consumer markets don't offer that certainty. That's why everyday buyers feel the shock first. When supply has to be reshuffled quickly, retail takes the hit. Prices move faster, availability shrinks, value erodes, and because US-China tensions aren't easing, they're becoming permanent. This instability isn't temporary, it's structural. That's what makes this backlash different. It isn't driven by a bad launch or a temporary shortage. It's being fed by global rivalry, national security fears, and political decisions Nvidia can't control, only react to. And when geopolitics start dictating who gets access to power, markets stop behaving rationally, which is why the backlash keeps growing, and why Nvidia can't simply PR its way out of this. Why this backlash creates openings for Nvidia's rivals. This is where Nvidia's situation becomes genuinely dangerous, not because it's weak, but because pressure creates alternatives. When one company becomes too dominant, too expensive, and too politically constrained, the market doesn't wait for it to fail. It starts building ways around it. And right now, Nvidia is accidentally doing something it never intended to do, making its competitors look viable. Let's start with the most obvious threat. AMD doesn't need to beat Nvidia at the high end. It just needs to exist as a credible second option. When buyers feel squeezed, good enough suddenly matters more than best in class. AMD benefits every time Nvidia's prices feel untouchable, every time supply tightens, and every time customers feel locked in. Availability becomes leverage, pricing becomes leverage, even sentiment becomes leverage. Then there's Intel. For years, Intel struggled to stay relevant in high-performance compute. But geopolitics changed the rules. Governments now care less about peak performance and more about control, location, and reliability. Intel's domestic manufacturing, political alignment, and government backing suddenly matter more than raw benchmarks. That's not a technical advantage. It's a strategic one. When regulators and governments want alternatives to Nvidia, Intel gets invited back into conversations it used to be excluded from. Subsidies, defense contracts, and long-term infrastructure deals don't always go to the best chip. They go to the safest supplier. And then there's China. Export controls didn't kill demand inside China. They redirected it inward. Chinese companies have no choice but to accelerate their own semiconductor ecosystems. That means more funding, more urgency, and more tolerance for imperfect solutions. Every restriction placed on Nvidia becomes motivation for Chinese chipmakers to catch up faster. Even if those chips lag today, the incentives are massive. National pride, national security, economic independence, that combination creates pressure that doesn't fade, it compounds. But the most underestimated threat isn't a rival company, it's custom silicon. Big tech firms are quietly asking a question that should worry Nvidia more than any competitor. Why are we paying Nvidia margins at all? Cloud giants are already designing their own chips for AI training, inference, and specialized workloads. They don't need general-purpose GPUs. They need chips tailored to their own systems. Every internal accelerator, every TPU, Trainium, Inferentia-style project reduces Nvidia's leverage. These companies don't need Nvidia to disappear, they just need to depend on it less. And once that shift begins, it's almost impossible to reverse. This is how dominance erodes in the real world, not with a dramatic collapse, but with diversification, with alternatives, with quiet exits. Nvidia's backlash is accelerating all of that. Consumers become more willing to try alternatives. Enterprises negotiate harder, governments fund competitors, rivals gain legitimacy simply by existing outside Nvidia's gravity. Ironically, Nvidia's greatest strength, being everywhere, has turned into its biggest vulnerability. Because once the world decides that relying on one company is too risky, it doesn't wait for permission to move on. It builds around you. That's why this moment matters. Not because Nvidia is failing, but because the balance of power is shifting. And once competitors gain momentum, no amount of dominance guarantees control anymore. The backlash isn't just noise, it's the opening signal. This isn't the story of a company collapsing. It's the story of a company becoming too important, too fast. Nvidia didn't fail, it won. And in winning, it triggered forces it can no longer fully control. Political pressure, market backlash, rising competition, and a growing discomfort with how much power now flows through a single gatekeeper. What began as an AI boom quietly turned into a squeeze on access, a squeeze on prices, and a squeeze on ownership. At the center of all this is Jensen Huang, no longer just leading a chip company, but navigating governments, global rivalries, and a world starting to ask uncomfortable questions about dependence and control. Because once people feel pushed out, priced out, or locked in, trust begins to erode. And when trust erodes, alternatives start to rise. That's the real backlash Nvidia is facing. Not anger, rebalancing. The world isn't rejecting Nvidia, it's hedging against it. So the next time you hear that Nvidia is doing better than ever, remember what that actually means. Power attracts attention. Attention attracts resistance. And resistance always creates change. The only question now is how fast that change comes. And who benefits when it does? If this breakdown helped you see what's really happening beneath the hype, make sure you like the video so more people see it, and subscribe for deeper, no-fluff analysis like this, because this story isn't over. It's just getting started.